Hello everyone, and welcome back to Generic Entertainment, where we talk about generic subjects like books and literally anything else I feel like talking about. I wanted to talk a little bit about what books I've been reading this year, because even though I did not get a tremendous amount of reading done this year, I enjoyed pretty much every single book I read, and many of them, if not most of them, I enjoyed tremendously. So every book on this list I highly recommend if you're into reading that sort of thing. Anyway, without further ado, the first book is Nova by Samuel Delany. This book had me enraptured from the very first page. It's a science fiction story that takes a lot from Moby Dick and also Grail Quest type stories in general. There is a tremendous amount of world building packed into this relatively short book. It's only 250 pages or so, to the extent that when I was reading this, it felt like I was reading a multiple book long series. The plot of this book follows a crew of characters led by a Captain Lork von Ray, who is hunting an elusive metal known as Illyrion, which can only be found inside of supernovas. And very much like Ahab and Moby Dick, he went on a quest to retrieve this Illyrion some years ago and was badly wounded in the attempt. And now, at the start of this book, he is assembling a crew of people to carry out this insane mission to dive into the heart of a supernova and retrieve this metal from the inside. The story jumps around between the present and the past, exploring Lork von Ray's entire life from his childhood up until now. And all of the characters, not just him, are very well fleshed out, especially this duo that is sort of the emotional core of the story. These two characters named Mouse and Katten, who are polar opposites of each other in a lot of ways. Katten is very slow and not very sure of himself. He has this tendency to overthink things, whereas Mouse is sort of the opposite. He tends to rush head on into situations and is very energetic. And the way these two characters play off of each other is very much a delight. I definitely want to read more things by Samuel Delany. He's considered one of the greats of science fiction, and this is a rather early Samuel Delany book, so I'm interested to see how his style evolves. So the next book is Pattern Recognition by William Gibson. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because I've already done a whole separate video about it that you can watch, but I still stand by what I said in that video, in that this is a really unique book that explores the modern world from a sort of cyberpunk perspective. William Gibson is one of the pioneers of the cyberpunk genre, and he sort of applies that lens of hyperfixation on advertising and mega corporations and social media to the modern world, and shows how the internet and other communications technologies have changed the way we think and given rise to experiences that we wouldn't have even been able to imagine just 50 or so years ago. The prose is exquisite in this book. The plot is really unique. It's a sort of mystery thriller type thing, but very slow and thoughtful at the same time. I definitely recommend this one, and if you want to hear more about that, you can go look at my other video. So next we've got Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This is a piece of dystopian fiction, and the situation presented in this book is just incredibly bleak, but also optimistic in a way that most dystopian fiction isn't. I've read a fair amount of dystopian fiction, and this book, while the situation presented in the book is not necessarily unique in its bleakness per se, what's unique about this book is its ability to look away from the present and towards the future, and how we can emerge from bleakness to form a better world. The book follows a girl who at the start of the book is about 15. She is living in a community that is isolated from the outside world. America has essentially become a third world country at this point in time. There's violent crime everywhere. A climate crisis has led to an energy crisis. There is essentially no law and order anymore. Everything is kind of in a state of extremely violent anarchy. And in the middle of that, you have this girl who is extremely idealistic and starts a religion for herself, which at first just exists sort of in her own head, but she starts writing down in her journal all these maxims about this religion, which she calls Earthseed. And that religion becomes the foundation of a movement that slowly, over time, starts to envelop more and more people. One of the major themes in this book is change and how change can be shaped by seemingly small actions which have dramatic consequences in the long term. It's a really powerful portrait of how personal philosophies can spread and become more than just personal philosophies, but entire religions. I might want to make a separate video about this book in the future because there are lots of ways in which it's very relevant to today's world. But overall, this is a really solid read and really unique among the kind of dystopian fiction genre for its sort of future-oriented, cautiously optimistic perspective on things. Next, we've got the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, which starts with this book, The Three-Body Problem. This series is probably the most horrifying piece of fiction I have ever read. I don't read a lot of horror. I'm not really a horror guy. And this series is not horror per se, it's science fiction. But the events of this novel, and especially the way this novel presents the state of the universe as the author envisions it, is genuinely scarier than any horror media I have encountered because it seems so plausible. Basically, this series is about the Fermi paradox, the question of if life arose on Earth, then it's probably likely that life arose elsewhere. And if that's the case, where are all the aliens? Why haven't we encountered alien species in the long history of our planet? And it's a question that many sci-fi series try to answer, but the answer that this book provides is wholly unique and also wholly terrifying. I've read a lot of science fiction and I thought I had been exposed to most of the major ideas out there, but Cixin Liu, with his physicist background, comes up with some crazy concepts related to string theory and higher dimensionality and stuff like that. That's just really intriguing and unique. So the series follows the story of humanity from the time we first make contact with an alien species into the distant future. And essentially what happens is, in this first book, a top secret research project in the 1960s successfully makes contact with an alien race in the Alpha Centauri system. The aliens on this world, called Trisolarans, their world is on the verge of destruction, and so they immediately launch a fleet to invade Earth. But the fleet won't arrive for over 400 years. So the plot of the series takes place over the course of hundreds of years and follows humanity as they're trying to find ways to thwart this invasion that hasn't even really started. And because of certain technologies that the Trisolarans have, which I won't get into for fear of spoilers, that proves to be pretty much impossible. This is not a feel-good story about humanity defeating alien overlords. This is not Independence Day or something like that. This is a shockingly realistic and very bleak depiction of what would actually happen if humanity came into contact with an alien species that was far more advanced technologically than it. There are some themes about the awesomeness of humanity and how we can achieve great things when we come together. But those themes are tempered by this description of the universe as a very cold and unforgiving place where love is often punished and brute force is often rewarded. It's a great read, but it is very heavy emotionally. I made an entire video about my reactions to this, so I would recommend the series, but be forewarned that it presents quite a bleak picture of the universe and humanity's future in it. I will also say that not every book in this series is equal. I think the first book is easily the weakest, and if you read the first book and don't like it, then definitely pick up the second, because the second book is a masterpiece. It's easily the best book in the series, I think, and the third book is really good as well. Okay, so moving right along, the next book is The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. And I've never read anything by Thomas Pynchon. I came in with preformed notions about what I expected Thomas Pynchon's writing to be like. A lot of people really like to make fun of Thomas Pynchon for being wordy and somewhat obnoxious.
Nobody's actually this pretentious.
But I decided to pick up this book anyway because it's really short. It's only like 150 pages. And I was quite pleasantly surprised by it. This book is about a conspiracy that may not in fact be a conspiracy, but actually the delusions of somebody who is losing her mind. The plot revolves around an organization known only as Tristero, which has ostensibly existed for hundreds of years. And the main character, Oedipa Mass, as the story goes on, keeps finding more and more connections to this organization and starts suspecting that everything in the world and the entire history of humanity has kind of been influenced by this organization in one way or another. And she starts getting this sense of kind of the contingency of history and how these major historical events of the past that we consider to be inevitable are actually sort of the results of random occurrences and selfish individuals trying to influence events to increase their own wealth. There's definitely something very postmodern about it. It's about paranoia and how in the modern world we tend to find connections between things that aren't actually connected, but also how things are connected that we don't expect to be connected. And there's this kind of struggle between, well, is this actually a global conspiracy, or is this just me being deranged, or is it somehow both? It's a really just fascinating story if you're interested in getting a taste of Thomas Pynchon and what his writing is about, because from what I understand, this is the subject matter that most of his books are about. Then I think this is a great place to start. So then we have Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. I picked this book up because I recently watched the movie Blade Runner 2049, and this book plays a central role in that movie. It takes the form of a commentary, a very long-winded commentary, on a poem written by an author who is also a fictional character within the world of this novel. So there are multiple different layers to this novel, and Nabokov balances them all out perfectly. When I went into this novel, what I was expecting was something fairly serious, and what I was not expecting at all was how funny this novel is. This novel is an absolute riot. The story, once you piece it together, is about this man named Charles Kinbote, who is the next door neighbor to John Shade, the person who wrote the poem that forms the kind of the centerpiece of this story. Kinbote is sort of a pseudo-intellectual idiot who tries to insert himself into the poet's life and pretends that he's the best friend of this poet. And as it would turn out, it's all in order to become the person who has the right to publish the manuscript for this poem after John Shade is killed. And into this commentary about the poem that Kinbote writes, he inserts all sorts of anecdotes about himself and his own life and his own interests, trying as much as possible to make this commentary more about himself than it is about John Shade and his own life, even though the poem that John Shade wrote is very autobiographical. The voice that Nabokov uses for writing Kinbote is so cynical and satirical, and the novel as a whole is just a masterclass in balancing tragic elements with comic elements. You'll find yourself laughing, and then suddenly Nabokov will hoodwink you and you'll be thrust into a really serious situation. It's a very unusual novel, but it's a lot more readable than I expected it to be, honestly. And I found it a very enjoyable reading experience, despite going into it thinking that it might be a sort of hyper-postmodern book that's more obsessed with its own gimmicks than with actually telling a story. Next we have Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I'm a big Neil Gaiman fan, and so it was no surprise to me that I liked this book. I have been kind of savoring the Neil Gaiman books that I have not read, just so that I don't run out of new Gaiman to read, since he is one of my favorite currently working authors. I have not even read American Gods yet, but I'm a big fan of The Sandman. Neverwhere has everything that makes Neil Gaiman amazing. It's extremely dark and twisted at times, but it's also full of hope and light in the way that only Neil Gaiman is able to do. I've never really encountered an author who's able to balance darkness and lightness so effectively and go all the way into the darkness without having it ruin the kind of hopeful tone of the story. This book takes place in London and is about a kind of whole secret world of people living in the London underground, and about an ordinary man who kind of gets thrust into this world. It's a sort of portal fantasy, except that the fantasy world is just kind of parts of London that are more hidden and inhabited by various mythological beings. It's Gaiman. It's fantastic. If you haven't read Gaiman, then go read Gaiman. That's what I have to say about this one. And so finally, I had to mention a token nonfiction book, because believe it or not, I don't just read fiction, I do read nonfiction as well. And so I wanted to mention Doing Good Better by Will MacAskill. This book is about charity, and specifically how it's both a lot harder than you might expect it to be and also a lot easier than you might expect it to be. It's harder because there are a lot of charities out there, and it's hard to know which ones are actually effective in achieving their goals of helping the people they're trying to help. He gives some fantastic examples in here of some really popular charities that turned out to not really help anyone in the communities they were trying to help, and ended up making things worse. One of the analogies he uses in this book to describe the inefficient way in which a lot of charities are run is this story about somebody who goes into a general store, gives the store owner a bunch of money, and gets a bunch of random items back in return, but doesn't really know prior to giving them money what items they're going to get, which would obviously be an absurd way to spend our own money on ourselves. And yet that's oftentimes how we spend money when we're trying to help other people. When we give money to charitable organizations, we don't know necessarily how that money is going to be spent, because a lot of these organizations are very opaque. And so for all we know, we could just be throwing money at the wall and funding interventions that aren't very effective. Which is not to say that the case is hopeless, just that in a lot of cases we need better transparency with charities to know what we're getting out of them. And he gives a lot of examples in here of effective and ineffective charities and what those both look like. But it's also easier than you might expect, because one of the main points he makes in this book is that if you have an income that is moderate or even low by American standards, you are in the top 1% of income earners in the entire world, which means that by donating your excess income to the people who are worse off in the world, like the bottom 25th percentile of income earners, you can do a tremendous amount of good with your money, far more than you think you're able to. But the key is to do extensive testing with the impacts that your charity is funding in order to assess whether people are counterfactually better off than they would have been without that charity. Personally, this book made me a lot more optimistic about charitable giving. And so yeah, I'd recommend it if charity and global development and these sort of subjects are something that is of interest to you. All right, so if you've watched this far, thank you so much for listening to me ramble. Those are some of my favorite books that I've read this year. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe and all that stuff. And let me know what you've been reading this year, of course. Yeah, thanks so much, and stay generic.